Welcome to Tradition and Sanity. When a monk helped a Soviet bureaucrat take up an unlikely profession. In honor of the Great Council that formulated our creed 1700 years ago today. 1,700 years ago today, on June 19th in the year of our Lord 325, the Nicene Creed was adopted by the Council after which it is named. While the date is not absolutely certain, it is probably the right one. As the Old Catholic Encyclopedia says, quote, "The year 325 is accepted without hesitation as that of the First Council of Nicaea. There is less agreement among our early authorities as to the month and day of the opening." In order to reconcile the indications furnished by the ecclesiastical historian Socrates and by the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon, this date may perhaps be taken as the 20th of May, and that of the drawing up of the symbol as the 19th of June. It may be assumed, without too great hardihood, that the synod, having been convoked for the 20th of May, in the absence of the emperor, held meetings of a less solemn character until the 14th of June, when, after the emperor's arrival, the sessions properly so called began, the symbol being formulated on 19th June, after which various matters, the Paschal controversy, etc., were dealt with, and the sessions came to an end on the 25th of August. Unquote. Many articles have been written about the significance of this council and of the creed it formulated. Christians of nearly all denominations find in this profession of faith a common point of agreement and orientation, despite their many differences. Today, in a spirit of rejoicing for this inestimable gift of divine assistance to the early Church in the midst of one of the worst crises that had afflicted and would continue to afflict her, the Arian controversy, I would like to share an absolutely delightful chapter from one of my favorite books to read aloud, Everyday Saints and Other Stories, edited by Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov. You can find out more about him in a certain story at Inside the Vatican. The link is at the Substack. Everyday Saints relates one amazing, miraculous, or hilarious story after another about the zealous faith and fortitude of Orthodox Christians during the Soviet period. We learn of countless ways in which they tricked or circumvented the officially atheistic regime. I realize that many have a low opinion of Russia and of the Russian Church, especially in recent years, but I would urge you to give this book, published in 2018, a chance to show you a different side, one that traditional Catholics, in particular, will easily relate to and take comfort in. Without further ado, here is Father Avakum and the Religious Affairs Commissioner from Pskov. One summer evening, the watchman of the Holy Gates of Pechory Monastery, old Father Avakum, announced to us all in the refectory after evening prayers that he would no longer let non-believers into the monastery. Enough is enough. He was sick of the simpering, shamelessly dressed young tourist hussies walking hand in hand with their godless boyfriends who stink for a mile from cigarette smoke. One day it's communists with holy rollers, the next it's those newfangled ecumenists, and the next day it's Zionists locked in embrace with the Mujahideen. Time to put an end to it. No one paid the least mind to the old man's grumbling, but somebody asked him, "And how would you be able to know whether or not the person before you is a true Orthodox believer?" Avakum thought about it carefully for a moment, but only for a moment. "Anyone who can read the symbols of the faith, I will allow in. If not, wander around the walls, but you've got no business in our monastery." Everyone laughed at the old man's words and soon forgot about them. But next morning, when after services the monks went about their tasks, they were surprised to notice that it was unusually empty in the monastery. Pious pilgrims were wandering around the churches crossing themselves, and familiar grannies had come to be blessed, and wanderers with their wanderers' bundles on their staffs were resting after the liturgy, and the holy fools were running around near the well. But the normally pestiferous crowds of tourists had disappeared somewhere. It was like a scene from ancient Holy Russia. It seemed that Father Avacum had worked a miracle and had truly kept his word. And so it was. Since the crack of dawn, when he had assumed his post as the watchman of the Holy Gates, Father Avacum had demanded that anyone who tried to come in read aloud the ancient Nicene Creed, articulated by the fathers of the first ecumenical councils that took place in Constantinople during the 4th century. His calculation was remarkably simple. Any true Orthodox believer would definitely know this text by heart. From 5:30 until 10 in the morning, not one of the visitors to the monastery had any trouble reciting the creed. But after 10 o'clock, the first 2 buses had arrived from Pskov. Naturally, not one of the Soviet tourists had been able to pass Father Avacum's simple test. All of them complained and threatened him as they stood frustrated before the locked gates of the monastery. But for an old soldier like Father Avacum, who had finished the war at the siege of Budapest, these threats were nothing if not ridiculous. Yet another tour bus rolled up. Out came a group of foreign tourists. By noon there was a large and absolutely enraged crowd milling about the locked gates of the monastery. That crowd was, of course, noticed by the chief overseer for religious affairs of the Pskov Provincial Communist Party Committee, Nikolai Alexandrovich Yudin, who was driving up in an official black Volga sedan on his way to have lunch with the monastery's abbot. Everyone in the monastery pronounced the name of this officer in an exaggerated way, Yudin, as in Judas. It was not that this overseer for religious affairs was worse than any of the others, but simply that any overseer over church life by definition was a symbol of the enslavement of the church. Actually, to be fair, it must be said that Nikolai Alexandrovich was a rather kind fellow. Although he had worked for many years in the organs of state security, he had not been made cruel from an excess of power. That said, he was nonetheless the complete master of the fates of all the clergy who were under his department's supervision. On his own whim, he could remove any priest simply by taking away his so-called registration, which would mean that the priest no longer had any right to work in the church. And that was the least that he could do. The enmity of the overseer could absolutely result in an extremely unpleasant range of choices for the priest, given the power that any worker in the KGB had to do almost anything he wanted to someone whom he considered dangerous to the Soviet state. Therefore, all abbots of the monastery, not to mention simple priests, would rush to the office of the overseer as soon as they were summoned. All, that is, except for our abbot, Archimandrite Gabriel. He was the only one to whom Yudin would come himself, if any question needed to be solved. Why was this the case? I think it was because our abbot knew how to comport himself with a certain indisputable air of authority. Also, Father Gabriel was incredibly strong and independent, and strict. Whatever he decided, happened. He always got his way. Of course, there were certain poisonous tongues who alleged that Overseer Yudin was actually going to the monastery to be called out on the carpet because our abbot's rank in the Secret Service was actually higher than his. Actually, while that is nonsense, it is understandable that monastery abbots in those days could not avoid having ties, or at least relationships, with representatives of the power of the state. When he saw the outrageous mess in his bailiwick, Nikolai Alexandrovich Yudin immediately got out of his car. He quickly found out what the trouble was, and loudly pounded his fist on the ancient iron-gilded oak planks of the doors. "Who's on duty there? Open up at once." "Recite the symbol of the faith," the old monk growled from behind the gates. "What?" The overseer could not believe his ears. "What symbol? What faith? Open up at once, I'm telling you." "Recite the symbol of the faith," said the grizzled monk implacably. Nikolai Alexandrovich was already gasping for breath. "Who do you think you are? What insolence! I am Yudin. Open right now, or you'll regret it." "Read the symbol of the faith." This inspired dialogue continued in just this fashion for another 10 minutes. Finally, looking at his watch, the overseer began to yield. I beg you to let me in. I'm already a whole 15 minutes late to see the abbot. Can you imagine how displeased he'll be?" There was a brief pause from behind the gates. Clearly, old Father Avacum could imagine the unhappy fate of someone who had kept Archimandrite Gabriel waiting. "Indeed," he sighed with sympathy, "I don't envy you." But then he once more implacably said, "Recite the symbol of our faith." "But I don't know your symbol of faith," said the overseer. "What on earth is it?" Father Avacum once more thought deeply to himself, and then made a decision. "All right, let it be so. Now repeat after me." From behind the gates emerged the words to the ancient symbol of our Orthodox faith, the words of the Constantinople Nicene Creed. "I believe," Father Avacum intoned. "I believe." The overseer nearly choked on his words as he stared at the tourists in humiliation. "In one God, the Father," said Father Avacum triumphantly. "In one God, the Father," said the overseer resignedly. "The Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, maker of heaven and earth." The overseer of the Communist Party Regional Soviet's People's Commission for Oversight of Religious Affairs for Pskov Province publicly declared the final dogma, expressed in the prayer, "I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come. Amen." Then the gates slightly opened up a crack, and the bureaucrat was led into the courtyard of the monastery. Raging at his inquisitor through his teeth and burning him up with his eyes, the overseer raced ahead to the abbot's office, where the abbot was waiting for him in an extremely irritated mood. "What is your excuse, Nikolai Alexandrovitch, for keeping me waiting half an hour?" our abbot reproached his guest. "It wasn't me." The overseer was in a rage by now. "It's because of the mess you have going on here. You put some madman at your gates. He won't let anyone in unless they read some sort of symbol of the faith. There were buses full of tourists waiting outside. Angry foreigners are there, fussing and fuming. Can you imagine the scandal that's brewing?" At this the abbot got nervous. He immediately summoned the father manager to find out what was going on and settle things down. He asked that Avacum be summoned at once to the abbot's office for punishment. When Avacum walked into the dining room, the overseer had been calmed down with some honeyed words from the abbot, plus a heaping table and a good dose of French cognac the abbot kept handy just in case. When he saw Father Avacum, the abbot broke into a rage as he rose from his chair. "What have you done? Without my permission, willfully making up your own rules in the monastery?" Now, making up one's own rules instead of just obeying is truly a dire sin for a monk. The abbot was absolutely correct here, and Father Avacum immediately realized his sin. He rushed to the table and threw himself at the feet of Father Gabriel. "I've been wrong. Forgive me, Father Abbot." "Get out of here! Making up your own rules?" The abbot was so enraged as he thundered over the prostrate monk that the walls shook. He even kicked Avacum with his boot. The overseer was beside himself with vengeful delight. But once the overseer had left, the abbot once again asked Father Avacum to come and see him. No sooner had the latter entered the room than he again prostrated himself at his abbot's feet. "Very well, excellent, good for you." Father Gabriel generously offered Father Avacum a bottle of Napoleon brandy. "Here, have some." That evening, Avacum and a few other elderly monks who were also former soldiers had the chance to experience the abbot's legendary cognac. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.
Єдино хрещення, Богославлення,